A chilling discovery in the meadow. The morning began with a bone-chilling stillness that seemed to settle over the rolling fields on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, New Jersey, a place more often described as sleepy than sinister. Local farmer Hank Peterson, a man of routines and few words, started his day before dawn as he always did, pulling on a battered pair of boots and grabbing his thermos of black coffee. The mist clung stubbornly to the ground as he made his way out to check his cattle grazing along the tree line, expecting nothing more unusual than the occasional stubborn cow stuck in the fence. But that morning, something immediately felt wrong. Hank's old hound, Buddy, refused to follow along the trail like he always did. Instead, the dog's hackles stood on end, his nose pointed into the haze toward the northern edge of the pasture. The low, nervous whining from the cattle echoed a quiet alarm. As Hank approached the commotion, his heart thudded with a nameless dread. There, at the feet of the herd, the grass was matted and glistening in a way no dew could explain. He was greeted by a sight that would forever haunt him, a woman's body, unclothed and battered, sprawled in sharp contrast against the green of the meadow. The stillness around her was absolute, crimson streaks fanned out from beneath her, staining the earth and painting stark evidence of the violence that had occurred just hours before. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, fixed and wide, turned skyward in perpetual shock. Even Hank, a man who had seen his share of injuries and livestock deaths, staggered back, fighting the urge to turn and run from the grotesque tableau. Trembling, he yanked his cell phone from his jacket and dialed the local sheriff with hands that could barely press the keys. When the Cedar Ridge deputies arrived, they found the scene unchanged. The victim's body lay untouched apart from the wind swaying her hair. The officers, hardened by years in rural law enforcement, found themselves choking back nausea and disbelief. The horrifying state of the woman's remains, the bruises, lacerations, the way her limbs were positioned as if abandoned carelessly, spoke of a brutality that the town had never encountered. Photographs, snapped by shaking hands, would circulate among police and eventually media archives, continuing to remind all of the horror. With sirens cutting through the silent countryside, more vehicles soon descended upon the field. Medical examiners, crime scene investigators, and higher-level detectives from the state. Each step around the body risked disturbing grainy, invaluable clues. Tire tracks pressed into the damp earth, a single button torn from clothing, a faintly smeared lipstick stain on a stone nearby. The field, once just a part of Hank's daily toil, was transformed into a solemn epicenter of grief, terror, and frantic investigation. The violence of the crime was matched only by the eerie sense that, for some reason, it had chosen to unfold in one of the most tranquil corners of New Jersey. For days afterward, townspeople would drive past the police barricades in silence, their faces pale, exchanging whispers about the unspeakable. Hank Peterson, for his part, never again walked his fields alone at daybreak, always accompanied by Buddy, who too seemed to never quite lose the edge of vigilance after what they'd found. Maplewood, a patchwork town of colors, conflicts, and contrasts. When people talk about small-town America, they often imagine tranquil avenues lined with neat white fences, friendly greetings exchanged on front porches, and the comforting sense that everyone knows your name. Maplewood, New Jersey on the surface seemed to fit perfectly into that iconic image. It boasted tree-lined streets, historic brick buildings, and local businesses that had passed from one generation to the next. Colorful flower beds spilled onto the sidewalks in spring, while autumn painted the town in brilliant golds and fiery reds. At the heart of Maplewood, a bustling community center held everything from Sunday farmers markets to summer movie nights, bringing people together across generations. Yet, beneath the postcard charm, Maplewood was anything but simple. Decades of influxes from various immigrant communities meant languages mingled and customs collided. Irish, Italian, Polish, West African, Dominican, Haitian, and Filipino families had all at one point staked a claim here in search of a better life. You could walk a few blocks and, in a single afternoon, buy Polish kielbasa at the deli, sip Dominican coffee at a bodega, and watch a Filipino parade down Main Street. Fusing these cultures created a vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy, but it also set the stage for friction simmering just below the surface. By the 1980s and into the early 90s, Maplewood faced pressures common to many American towns grappling with rapid change. Factories that had once provided blue-collar prosperity shuttered, leaving hundreds scrambling for new jobs. Families struggled to keep their homes, store owners found fewer customers willing to spend, and abandoned storefronts dotted the downtown strip. For teens and young adults with dwindling prospects, the allure of street gangs and the easy money promised by the drug trade became all too real. Law enforcement soon recognized Maplewood was a powder keg. Petty thefts grew into muggings, which soon bled into more serious violence. Graffiti marred the clean faces of schools. Whispers about turf wars moved from behind closed doors into everyday conversation. The once peaceful train station became a site of unease after dark, with police patrols quietly doubling after a handful of late-night assaults. Parents no longer let their children bike freely after sundown, and neighbors, used to unlocked doors, began triple-checking the deadbolts each night. Yet what set Maplewood apart was the resilience embedded deep within its social fabric. Many residents refused to let fear fracture their relationships. Neighborhood watches sprang up seemingly overnight. Pastors and imams organized joint prayer walks through troubled blocks, and local business owners pooled resources for youth programs meant to offer hope and an escape from the streets. There was a collective drive to not only protect but to reclaim the spirit of the town they loved, blending the grit needed for survival with the optimism that defines the American dream. But the environment that shaped Maplewood in these years was complicated, filled with threads of connection and tension, hope and hardship, celebration and grief. In this unlikely crossroads of cultures at once colorful and conflicted, fate would soon unfold a tragedy that would leave no one untouched. The victim, Melissa Grant. Melissa Grant was, in many ways, the embodiment of Maplewood's best hopes and deepest vulnerabilities. At just 26 years old, she was already admired by many for her unwavering optimism and magnetic presence, a young woman often described as a bright light by family, colleagues, and frankly anyone who met her even once. Born into a mixed heritage household, her mother hailed from New Jersey's old Irish stock, her father, an immigrant from Jamaica. Melissa grew up balancing two worlds. Holidays at the Grant house might have included both corned beef and fried plantains, and family parties always ended with someone thumping rhythms on a steel drum borrowed from her uncle. She excelled in school, voted friendliest student by her graduating class, while also holding the coveted role of captain on the girls' swim team. Her laugh was famous, bubbly, a little too loud for libraries, and utterly contagious. But it wasn't just charisma that set her apart. From a young age, Melissa took responsibility seriously. The eldest of three siblings, she looked after her kid brother while their parents worked night shifts. If a neighbor fell ill, she'd show up with groceries and a homemade casserole. Friends recount how, at the age of 16, she shepherded a stray dog through an emergency run to the vet, returning home at 3 a.m., exhausted but triumphant. Driven by a passion for helping others, Melissa pushed herself to attend nursing school at the nearest county college. There, she won the college's annual Spirit of Kindness Award, and landed an internship at St. John's Hospital, a busy, sometimes overwhelming urban hospital that quickly became her second home. Patients remembered her for her gentleness and humor. She'd hum old Motown songs while tending to wounds, crack jokes as she changed IVs, and never seemed to tire of bringing sunshine to the most dismal wards. Melissa's dreams, however, were never particularly grandiose. She confided in friends about wanting a modest house, a family of her own one day, maybe a vegetable garden. She'd been married briefly to Daniel Harper, a subway operator in the city. Although their marriage hit rocky ground and ended after a few years, largely due to the relentless hours and the stress that comes from living in a city that never seems to sleep, those who knew both of them say, no bitterness lingered. If anything, Melissa seemed to radiate more empathy after loss, pouring herself into her job and the tight-knit circles of friends she'd nurtured since high school. On weekends, she volunteered at the local community center teaching English lessons to new arrivals. She was the sort of neighbor who'd shovel your front stoop without being asked, who made friends with the barista, the crossing guard, and the street cleaner on her block. Every year she entered, and frequently won, Maplewood's annual pie baking contest with her signature apple cinnamon mango creation, a blend, she'd laugh, of both halves of me. Beneath Melissa's sunny exterior, though, lived a quiet resilience. She'd weathered the ups and downs that life in Maplewood threw her way, from close family illness to neighborhood disputes and economic downturns. Perhaps this was why the shock of her sudden disappearance, followed by the dark revelations surrounding her murder, hit Maplewood so hard. People were horrified not just by the violence, but by the loss of one of their own, someone who'd so freely given of herself to everyone, no matter their color, background, or story. The grief that engulfed the town was matched only by a stubborn hope, that her legacy of kindness, courage, and unflagging warmth would endure, even in the wake of tragedy. The fateful day, February 18, 1986, dawned on Maplewood with the soft, washed-out glow of winter sunlight. For most, it was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, a haze of work commutes, clattering school buses, and the bustle of daily routine. For Melissa Grant, the day was mapped out in her mind with typical precision. Finish her morning shift at St. John's Hospital, meet her friend Sarah for dinner, and catch the last train home from Manhattan to Maplewood. Like any day, she left nothing to chance. Her favorite blue nurse's bag slung over her shoulder, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, sneakers tied tight for her habitual brisk pace. She clocked out a few minutes after 5:30 p.m., exchanging cheerful goodbyes with colleagues. Sarah was waiting outside the hospital gates, engine idling, ready to sweep Melissa into the safe bubble of friendship and laughter. They drove through the Lincoln Tunnel in the soft twilight, skyline flickering in the rear view, and by 6:30 p.m. they were perched in a booth at a cozy Italian restaurant on the west side. Their ritual, carb-heavy plates of penne, shared dreams about travel, jokes about Sarah's latest dating misadventures, stretched into a comfortable, laughter-filled evening. Melissa, though effervescent as always, checked the clock every so often. She confessed a gentle worry about catching the late train. She'd promised her dad she wouldn't walk home alone too late. At 8 p.m. sharp, Sarah flagged the waiter for the check, and they made their way to Union Station. Manhattan pulsed with nighttime energy, but beneath the neon lights, Sarah felt an unease growing in Melissa, one she brushed off with a simple hug and a smile. At the station, the two friends lingered at the crowded platform, serenaded by the metallic echo of public announcements. Melissa was cautious, as always. She kept her hands on her bag and dodged the glances of strangers. She boarded the 8:47 p.m. train back to New Jersey, blowing a kiss to Sarah through the doors. It was their tradition, a wordless sign of "see you soon." They didn't know it, but that would be their last exchange. The train rattled past city lights and empty parking lots, slowing at each suburban outpost. Melissa, engrossed in a worn paperback, barely noticed the growing emptiness of the car, or the curious glances of two men lingering at the far end. When the train screeched into Maplewood Station just before 10 p.m., she was among the final passengers to disembark, her breath rising in plumes against the cold air. Normally, Melissa would use the payphone by the station to call her father, who would collect her in the family's battered Chevy. That night, however, the phone was out of order, a detail later verified by both Sarah and police canvassing the scene. Resolute, she zipped up her coat, hoisted her bag, and started down the dim sidewalk toward her childhood home. Streetlights were sparse, casting syrupy puddles of light on cracked pavement. Maplewood, after dark, was wrapped in an eerie quiet broken only by distant dog barks and the shuffle of her own steps. A lone sedan drove slowly past, its headlights briefly illuminating Melissa's determined face. She walked quickly, head down, but somewhere along that route, fate, unseen and inexplicable, intervened. Neighbors recalled hearing a brief, sharp scream, so abrupt and out of place it froze them in their beds. A single porch light flickered on. A porch dog barked twice, then fell silent. By 10:30 p.m. Melissa had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the growing undertow of dread that would soon sweep over Maplewood. That night her mother waited by the phone, clutching a cold cup of tea and watching each minute on the clock pass with increasing worry. Calls to Melissa's friends yielded nothing. Sarah too was already anxious, pacing her apartment. With midnight approaching, the Grant family finally dialed the local police, an act that would shatter the town's sense of security forever. Melissa Grant, the heart of her family and the lifeblood of her small town, was missing. The mysterious disappearance. When dusk crept across Maplewood that frigid February night, a slow unease also settled over the Grant household. Melissa was known for her punctuality and careful routines. By 10:30 p.m., her mother Cynthia was already quietly worried, glancing nervously at the hall clock every few minutes and refusing to turn off the porch light. At first, when Melissa didn't step through the door at her usual time, Cynthia tried to convince herself it was nothing, a delayed train, a lengthy call with a friend, a stop to help a neighbor. But as the minutes ticked into hours, her worry crystallized into real, consuming fear. Melissa's father, Ronald Grant, typically a calm and measured man, wrung his hands in silence, their house eerily quiet, except for the occasional ticking of the ancient grandfather clock. The phone never rang. Cynthia checked it repeatedly, even picking up to listen for a dial tone, hoping it hadn't gone dead. Still, nothing. At 11:15 p.m., Cynthia began calling Melissa's phone, but it rang unanswered, disturbing for someone as responsible as Melissa. Anxiety mounted as Cynthia dialed Sarah, Melissa's closest friend, who immediately confirmed they'd parted ways on time and that Melissa had boarded her usual train back from Manhattan. Sarah's voice quaked with concern. She would have called if she was running late, you know how she is. Ronald, hoping for answers, contacted several friends and neighbors, hoping his daughter had dropped by someone's house or decided to stay out later on a whim. Out of character, but maybe not impossible. Yet every single person they spoke to relayed the same answer. Melissa hadn't been seen nor heard from since she left the train station. With worry growing by the minute, Ronald paced between rooms, living room, kitchen, front porch, ever hopeful he'd spot Melissa's familiar silhouette at the end of the sidewalk. By midnight, Cynthia's composure finally broke. With hands trembling and voice barely above a whisper, she pleaded with Ronald to call the local police. He acquiesced, describing their daughter's appearance, her last known whereabouts, and her meticulous habits to the dispatcher. What began as a simple missing persons call quickly ballooned into an official search when police recognized Melissa's familiarity in the community and the unlikelihood she would vanish willingly. Maplewood's local officers arrived at the Grant house within the hour. Officer Linda Rodriguez, a veteran of the department and family friend, took down every detail with care and escalating concern. Melissa's blue nurse's bag, a detail relayed by Sarah, became a prominent note in the report. Cynthia offered a trembling smile at the memory, recalling how Melissa always tossed a protein bar and a bright red pen in its pockets, the sorts of harmless habits that suddenly took on ominous undertones. The police began canvassing major routes between the train station and the Grant residence. They visited the dimly lit, largely deserted sidewalks Melissa would have taken, their flashlights sweeping across empty lawns and abandoned mailboxes. Patrol cars idled slowly along the stretch, spotlights illuminating bushes and front stoops. Interviews with neighbors produced few leads. A couple had heard the faint echo of hurried footsteps. Someone else swore they'd seen the reflection of a passing sedan's headlights, but nothing conclusive. Most troubling was the malfunctioning public payphone at the station, a phone Melissa always used to call home for a nighttime pickup. A repair sticker from the phone company, issued the day before, confirmed it had been out of service all evening. It was a bitter twist of fate that forced Melissa to walk those shadowy blocks on her own that night. Within hours, flyers sprouted across local businesses and the train station, hurriedly pasted by Ronald and half a dozen desperate friends. Cynthia, her voice shaking but undeterred, called local hospitals, urgent care clinics, even animal shelters on a slim hope her daughter had decided to help a stray or been waylaid by some small crisis. Even as hope flickered, fear grew. By sunrise, word of Melissa's disappearance had swept through Maplewood like wildfire. News of her absence reached St. John's Hospital, where stunned colleagues immediately reached out to offer support. The town's community board, usually reserved for bake sales and block parties, filled with missing posters bearing Melissa's smiling photo and a description of her last known outfit. Police expanded their search, organizing volunteer teams to comb through small parks and alleyways. A retired schoolteacher recalled seeing a lone woman hurriedly cross Pine Street, but couldn't recall the time. Surveillance cameras in stores along her potential route were grainy and largely unhelpful. One security tape showed the vague outline of a woman with a similar build, but her face was obscured. Speculation rippled through the town. Some whispered Melissa might have left of her own accord, triggered by recent emotional stress or a secret relationship. Others worried she'd become the victim of a recent crime wave, a chilling possibility given the nearby incidents of robberies and assaults in the weeks before. A handful of parents forbade their children from walking unaccompanied until Melissa was found. The Grant family's home became a hub of activity, police radios squawking quietly in the background, neighbors offering casseroles and coffee in quiet solidarity, friends coming in and out with updates or simply to lend moral support. Cynthia refused to sleep, sitting up all night in the living room with the family dog curled by her feet, her gaze fixed on the front door. Ronald made hourly rounds of their block, sometimes driving his pickup to the edge of town as if the simple act of searching might somehow will Melissa back to safety. Every day brought new rumors and false hope. Sightings called into the tip line that all faded to nothing. Some claimed to have seen a woman matching Melissa's description with two men on a bus. Others reported finding her bag or discarded jacket in a nearby park, but none belonged to her. Police issued a county-wide bulletin and requested help from the New Jersey State Police, who brought in tracking dogs and additional detectives. For Melissa's siblings, the stretch of agonizing, sleepless nights left them numb and rootless, forced to imagine every possibility: abduction, medical emergency, runaway, or something still worse. At school, friends organized prayer circles and candlelight vigils in her honor, while teachers coordinated with local authorities to keep rumors from spiraling in the hallways. As the first week passed with no credible leads, dread became a steady presence in the Grant household. Cynthia maintained a calendar where she recorded every detail, each call from police, every vague tip, list after list of family friends who'd been contacted and routes that had been checked. On the seventh day, a local TV station aired a special segment on Melissa's disappearance, interviewing Ronald at the kitchen table as Cynthia squeezed his hand so tightly, her knuckles blanched white. Though the official search never lost momentum, each passing day, each hour without Melissa, deepened the town's collective anxiety. Maplewood, a patchwork of immigrants, old families, and new arrivals, came together in its fear and heartbreak, grappling with the yawning uncertainty left by one woman's unexplained absence. No one wanted to give voice to the worst-case scenarios, but the air in town seemed saturated with dread. Melissa Grant, who had always championed her neighbors in brighter days, now depended on their vigilance, empathy, and faith in the face of the most harrowing mystery Maplewood had ever known. The initial investigation: family under suspicion. When news of Melissa Grant's disappearance, and later, the gruesome discovery in the Cedar Ridge pasture, broke across Maplewood, the collective heartache rapidly evolved into a forensic frenzy. For law enforcement, no matter how tragic or high-profile the case, core investigative protocols demanded starting close to the victim's life, especially with those who knew her best and loved her most. Statistically, in cases of missing persons or homicide, answers, however painful, were often found within the victim's own circle. This doctrine would cast a haunting, sometimes traumatic shadow upon the Grant family, forever altering the course of their grief and relationships. Within hours of confirming Melissa's identity, detectives had established a mobile command post at the local police station, equipped with phones ringing off the hook and whiteboards scrawled with names, addresses, and color-coded timelines. Lead investigator Detective Frank Donnelly, a methodical professional known for his thoroughness and lack of sentimentality, called an urgent meeting with his core team. Their marching orders: build the victim's last 72 hours, account for every contact, every word spoken, every deviation from her habitual schedule. From the outset, her recently estranged husband, Daniel Harper, loomed large in the investigation's crosshairs. Though the split had been civil, amicable even, a distant echo of tension and private heartbreak could reverberate more deeply than outsiders supposed. The police discussed the statistics. Domestic partners, ex-spouses, and jilted lovers were far more likely than strangers to commit crimes of passion or desperation. Despite the Grant family's repeated assurance that Daniel was neither violent nor cruel, despite his own efforts showing up to help with search parties, volunteering at vigils, he could not shake the wary glances cast his way. Police visited Daniel's apartment before sunrise on the morning after the body's identification. He let them in without hesitation, red-eyed and unshaven, sitting heavily at his kitchen table as Detective Donnelly and a younger partner methodically reviewed his movements for the past week. Daniel's story never changed. He'd been working the late shift on the city subway line, clocked out after midnight, and had not seen Melissa in days. He produced timekeeping logs, union witnesses, and even traffic tickets as proof. Still, he fielded questions about their marriage's ending, whether arguments had devolved into violence, whether jealousy lingered below the surface. Daniel, for his part, answered with forthright, sometimes tearful honesty. He described a mutual, agonizing decision to separate after their lives had grown apart, but insisted the love and respect never left. When presented with the wedding ring officers had removed from Melissa's finger, he broke down entirely, sobbing into his hands, an image that seared itself into the recollection of every cop present, replacing suspicion with genuine pity, at least for a time. Parallel interviews unfolded in the Grant household. Cynthia and Ronald, Melissa's parents, endured round after round of questioning, their exhaustion compounded by what felt like endless invasions of privacy. Detectives asked for access to Melissa's journals, letters, and even bank statements. They inquired about each family member's whereabouts. They shadowed Ronald as he drove neighborhood search loops, double-checking his route. At one point, a uniformed officer carefully logged the contents of Cynthia's freezer. Absurd, perhaps, but in police work, no clue was too small or too strange to ignore. The Grants, heartbroken, did not protest. Extended family and close friends were next. Melissa's younger siblings faced gentle but persistent interrogation by a detective specializing in child interviews. Her cousins were tracked down at their workplaces. Her best friend Sarah was asked repeatedly about the dinner in Manhattan, the last conversations, any hints of a changed mood or secret trouble. Did Melissa seem afraid of anyone? Was anyone pursuing her romantically? Had she borrowed large sums of money, suddenly withdrawn, or expressed paranoia? The community, wanting desperately to support the family, sometimes bristled at the broad net law enforcement cast. As the week wore on, the investigation's scope widened. Forensic analysis of Melissa's apartment offered nothing suspicious. No signs of forced entry, no threatening correspondence, no hidden substance abuse. Her bank records were unremarkable. Routine purchases at local stores, train tickets, charitable donations. Cell phone records and payphone logs gave little away, especially since the public phone at the Maplewood station had been broken the night she vanished. Simultaneously, Daniel Harper's alibi underwent exhaustive validation. Transit security footage grudgingly confirmed his presence at the subway depot. His co-workers vouched for his demeanor on the night shift. Distracted, perhaps, but not distraught. Detectives canvassed his neighbors and found nothing irregular. His car tires, closely examined, carried no trace of rural mud or grass. The emotional toll, however, was profound. Reporters camped on his doorstep, content to imply guilt by association. Former friends grew distant, unsure how to comfort or trust him, an isolation that haunted Daniel long after his legal clearance. With family members and Daniel increasingly ruled out, the bitterness of suspicion lingered. In small-town America, whispers travel faster than facts. Some neighbors resented the perceived intrusion of police into private, grieving lives. Others speculated, they theorized about family rifts, generational feuds, and financial disputes that never existed. No matter what the detectives found, the fact that loved ones had been thoroughly examined, interrogated really, by the authorities, became a secondary wound. In Maplewood, the Grants and Daniel would always have been looked at by the police. Still, Detective Donnelly understood this uncomfortable truth. Only by clearing those closest to Melissa and doing so as openly as possible could the search for her real killer begin in earnest. His nightly case notes reflected his struggle, a balancing act between due diligence and human sensitivity. With every lead that exonerated a relative, the burden shifted outward, into the shadows of the wider community. The painful suspicion endured, but so did a renewed hope, that the monster who shattered their world did not wear a familiar face. As the calendar weeks crept by, one lesson became clear. The initial investigation's shadow would never fully depart from the Grant family, but it was this very rigor, this willingness to test every assumption, that finally set them free, and pointed law enforcement back toward the unknown danger lurking just beyond their front door. Corpses and identification. In the aftermath of Melissa Grant's disappearance, days blurred into one another for her family and the entire community. Each morning brought tightness to the chest, the kind that clung with the dread of what new, unthinkable updates might come. And then, one gray morning, a call shattered what hope still lingered. Authorities had found a body in a remote pasture on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a discovery that instantly banished any remaining pretense of ignorance or denial. The initial word spread with frightening speed, but it still took hours before official confirmation reached the Grants. Police handled the notification with ritual gravity. 2 detectives, one familiar, the other a grim-faced stranger, arrived at the modest family home, hats in hand, their eyes carrying the weight of too many such visits. Ronald Grant opened the door, already suspecting the worst. Cynthia followed, her hands balled up in nervous fists. Before the detectives could speak, the silent exchange in the foyer told the story. The process of formal identification was grueling. Melissa's parents and her recently estranged husband Daniel were escorted under police protection to the county medical examiner's office. The air inside was cold and sterile, humming with the low machines. Ronald and Cynthia moved with robotic slowness, clutching hands for support as they faced what no parent ever should. Officials spared them the most harrowing sights, but the necessity of confirmation remained. It was not just for closure. The law demanded that every box be checked, every grim protocol followed. What clinched the identification, paradoxically, was not just the sorrowful recognition of Melissa's face, ravaged by violence and exposure, but the simple, familiar gleam of the wedding ring still on her finger. Daniel, who had rarely let his emotions spill since the separation, visibly collapsed at the sight. He pressed the ring to his lips and wept openly. Later, police would recall that moment as both devastating and clarifying. No one could have doubted the authenticity or depth of his feelings for Melissa. There was pain, not pretense, loss, not guilt. Forensic teams had already cordoned off the meadow by the time the family arrived at the medical examiner. Investigators meticulously documented every angle, collecting samples from clothing, skin, and even beneath fingernails in desperate hope of finding a lead. Despite the wounds and the weather's effects, Melissa's distinctive blend of ethnic features, along with a small tattoo on her ankle, the tiny, playful heart her sister had once convinced her to get, further cemented the identification beyond question. One by one, personal effects were logged: her nurse's badge, a brass key with a blue plastic cover, fragments of what once was her favorite beaded necklace. The experience of viewing a loved one under these circumstances is singular and scarring. For Melissa's parents, the sharp lines of those clinical moments, the coroner's dry explanations, the click of camera shutters, the sound of zippers and latex gloves, blurred with the memories of their daughter still alive. Cynthia, for her part, broke down not with screams but a terrible animal hush, her grief turning inward, frozen. Ronald tried to speak, thanking the officers, asking impossible questions, but every word trailed off into silence. Daniel had to be supported out of the building by 2 detectives, his legs unable to function. The trauma of official identification left the family both relieved and destroyed. The endless, torturous wondering was now over, but the finality was a new kind of agony. In the hours after, Melissa's siblings were told with as much gentleness as the moment could allow, and friends from all corners of the town gathered quietly outside the Grant home, leaving notes, flowers, and homemade meals by the door. Grievers respected the family's privacy, but nobody in Maplewood felt untouched. Rumors faded, heartbreak replaced speculation. While legal formality required photographs and extensive paperwork, it was the tangible, personal items, her ring, her badge, her necklace, that truly closed the circle. Detectives later noted how these everyday relics, once part of simple routines, became almost sacred in grief. Daniel clung to the wedding ring for days, barely sleeping, turning it over in his hand, as if its weight might anchor him. Cynthia and Ronald packed away Melissa's clothes, her favorite coffee mug, her half-read books, each item now infused with longing and sorrow. Meanwhile, the medical examiner set to unearth the cause and timing of death, assembling a timeline that could help guide the still intensifying investigation. The autopsy documented the cruelty Melissa endured, but it also provided crucial forensic clues: traces of foreign fibers under her nails, patterns of bruising inconsistent with a simple altercation, signs that she had put up an intense fight. The medical examiner worked closely with detectives, providing information that could point toward both the murder weapon and likely time of the attack, narrowing the window for suspects' alibis. The way in which the identification unfolded irreversibly changed the Grant family. Deep inside, there was a fierce insistence on remembrance. Melissa would not be reduced to just another statistic, another file in a box. Her mother organized a nightly candle vigil. Her father, usually reticent, spoke to local newspapers about Melissa's light and legacy. Daniel withdrew from public view but later channeled his hurt into volunteer work that sought to protect others from similar horror. In the local church, at the hospital where Melissa had worked, and throughout the town, the acknowledgement of her fate, and the dignified manner in which her identity was reclaimed, became a rallying point. Friends who had once laughed with her now organized fundraisers for victims' assistance. Neighbors mended old rifts, finding in collective mourning a fleeting, if bittersweet, sense of unity. The ripple effects of Melissa's formal identification touched more than just her family. News of her death, first whispered, then blared through local radio and print headlines, hit Maplewood with the force of a gale. The town, already bruised by uncertainty during the days of frantic searching, now entered the heavier, darker stage of public mourning. Even those who had never met Melissa were shaken to the core. For months, conversations in diners, grocery stores, schools, and parks inevitably turned toward her loss. Community leaders, clergy, and local officials went door to door, making sure the family's wishes for privacy were respected, but also accepting that the trauma was a shared one. The media descended, eager for photographs and interviews. While some national reporters tried to sensationalize the horror, the Maplewood Gazette and neighborhood newsletters took a gentler route, sharing stories that highlighted Melissa's generosity and the small kindnesses she had shown in everyday life. School teachers designed memory walls, her old swim team dedicated a bench by the municipal pool, The hospital where she had worked established a scholarship fund in her name. These gestures may have seemed minor in the momentum of public grief, but for Melissa's family, each one was cherished, a reminder that her impact was indelible. At the same time, the specifics of the body's discovery sparked debates about safety and trust within the town. Parents redoubled efforts to escort children to and from school. Nightly patrols of neighborhood watch volunteers became common, often pausing for silent prayer at the edge of the very field where Melissa's body had been found. People swapped horror stories and hopeful rumors, wondering aloud about the presence of evil in their seemingly safe world. There was talk of self-defense classes, better street lighting, and more open communication with law enforcement. For investigators, Melissa's identification was not just the end of uncertainty, it was the ignition of dogged intensity. Detectives now had proof of violent foul play, and clear evidence to connect to whatever perpetrator lurked in or around Maplewood. The wedding ring, the bruises, and the forensic samples became rallying points for a manhunt fueled not just by police skill, but by a community's exhaustion and anger. The Grants, determined to reclaim some power from tragedy, met frequently with officers, asking relentless questions, demanding updates, and offering any memories, no matter how small, that might help. Ronald pored over old family albums with detectives, searching for anything that might be relevant. Cynthia, despite her heartbreak, organized neighbors to assist with canvassing and distributing flyers. The town's mourning also shaped the nature of the investigation. Detectives fielded hundreds of tips, many of them generated by the anxiety and suspicion the tragedy sparked. Unfortunately, for every credible lead, there were 10 fueled by fear, rumor, or personal vendetta. People wondered aloud if strangers could have been responsible, but some eyed longtime residents with new suspicion, fracturing decade-old friendships and forming cliques around wild theories. The police chief was forced to take to local radio, urging calm, unity, and patience, promising nothing would be rushed or hidden in the pursuit of justice for Melissa. Funeral arrangements were set with careful attention to both the family's wishes and community participation. The church overflowed on the day of the memorial, with lines of mourners stretching out onto the street. Friends, pastors, and colleagues spoke of Melissa's warmth, humor, and dedication, not just to nursing but to making every person feel seen and valued. No one in the congregation escaped the intensity of her parents' grief. Ronald, gray and diminished but resolute, speaking briefly about his daughter's dream of a better world. Cynthia, sometimes silent, sometimes softly humming lullabies to herself throughout the service, recalling happier times. Daniel was present, flanked by supportive relatives but still isolated in his grief. He was granted a few moments at the casket, pressing the returned wedding ring to his forehead before slipping it into his coat pocket, a private act of closure and promise. Even as the investigation continued, the Grants and Daniel found themselves swept up in a steady stream of letters, flowers, and donations. Maplewood felt the pain of Melissa's loss as its own, and the civic rituals followed in her honor knit the community together in rare solidarity. In the weeks after, investigators continued to analyze the forensic evidence collected from the scene and Melissa's body, knowing that a single overlooked detail could crack the case. Her funeral and subsequent media attention breathed new life into the search for clues. Some anonymous callers reported strangers lingering near the train station, while others described vehicles parked where they shouldn't be on the night Melissa disappeared. Officers painstakingly logged every tip, returning again and again to the medical examiner's notes, the analyzed fibers, and the fingerprints on the few belongings Melissa had carried. It was a challenging period for the family and community alike. The Grants attempted to reclaim a semblance of normalcy, but routine became a minefield of triggers. Melissa's favorite songs, the smell of her shampoo, the sight of the mailbox she used to check every morning. The psychological toll was steep, and neighbors organized meal trains, therapy funds, and group counseling sessions to support one another through collective trauma. Over time, the direct pain dulled into a persistent ache, but the circumstances surrounding Melissa's death and the way the town processed her loss left an enduring imprint. Photographs of the field where she was found were eventually placed in a police archive, but flowers still appeared there for years on the anniversary of her disappearance. The wedding ring ended up in a glass case at the town's community center, surrounded by heartfelt notes from friends and strangers alike, a symbol not just of Melissa's own story, but of Maplewood's resilience in the face of brutality. Lingering questions about the fateful night. As investigators retraced Melissa's footsteps on that chilling February night, The town itself seemed to collectively hold its breath, haunted by unanswered questions that refused to fade with the morning light. Every narrow avenue Melissa may have walked, every shadow cast by the flickering streetlights, became not just pieces of evidence, but puzzles saturated with dread. Each detail, no matter how mundane, felt sharpened by hindsight into a potential clue or an accusation. Detective Frank Donnelly, who had become almost a nocturnal fixture in Maplewood since the tragedy, obsessed over the scant evidence. He'd drive slowly down the route Melissa was forced to take, the one she had walked out of necessity rather than choice, owing to the broken public phone by the train station that night. The simple malfunction of a payphone, a now trivial relic in the age of cell phones, became a focal point for mounting regret. What if the phone had worked? What if her father had been able to pick Melissa up, as always? This piece of failed infrastructure, so innocuous on any other day, became an emblem of fate's cruel indifference. Forensic teams swept every block of the sidewalk Melissa had likely traversed, collecting fibers, scanning for shoe prints, checking discarded cigarette butts, and interviewing anyone who had looked out from their curtains between 10 o'clock and 10:30 p.m. An elderly couple on Elm Street vaguely recalled seeing a woman fitting Melissa's description, hurrying in the cold with her collar pulled high. A teen delivering newspapers insisted he saw a white sedan idling on the corner. Was it an innocent passerby, or was it the very car that would play a role in the crime? No sighting, no lead, felt conclusive. All were filtered through the distortions of fear, memory, and hindsight. Yearning for order and explanation, townspeople played out their own reenactments. A group of neighbors even walked the route from the station to the Grant home late one night, armed with flashlights and notebooks, desperate to see the world from Melissa's doomed perspective. They reported unsettling feelings of being watched, sudden eruptions of dog barking, and the bleak loneliness of the streets after dark. I never realized how isolated those blocks felt, until I had to imagine walking them alone, one volunteer confided to the press. The communal dread wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about understanding the horror of that specific walk, on that specific night. Questions swirled both privately and publicly. Had Melissa been followed from the train, or was it a chance encounter with someone already lurking in the neighborhood? Why had no one heard more than a single stifled scream? Had she been grabbed swiftly, prevented from crying out? Was it possible she knew her attacker, perhaps trusted them for a brief, fateful instant? Or was the whole event a tragic convergence of bad luck and premeditated predation? For Melissa's family, the questions took a different, sharper shape. Cynthia spent agonizing hours parsing over her daughter's schedule, conversations, even shopping receipts, wondering if she had missed a warning sign, a forgotten comment, a change in routine, a friend Melissa had not mentioned. Ronald, nearly silent since the funeral, resorted to late-night walks along the same sidewalk, as if his footsteps might unearth new clues through sheer force of will. Privately, he burned with self-reproach for not insisting harder that his daughter wait inside for her ride, or for not driving to the station earlier just in case. The police's logbooks filled thick with possible leads. Anonymous tips flooded the department. Some claimed to have seen a stranger lurking near the tracks before Melissa's train arrived, while others insisted the crime fit the pattern of a recent spate of robberies in nearby towns. Some leads were red herrings, an ex-con reported traveling through but later cleared. A local man with a white sedan offered a solid alibi, his car meticulously searched forensically. Still, unshakable questions lingered. Was the attack random or meticulously planned? Did the killer live among them or merely pass through Maplewood on the night of evil? Researchers and profilers were called in as panic grew, their expert theories both comforting and alarming. Often perpetrators are familiar with the routines of their victims, one FBI profiler told the police. This attacker either knew Melissa or surveilled the neighborhood enough to understand when someone would be most vulnerable. That analysis led to months of painstaking comb-throughs of phone logs, train manifestos, security tapes from local businesses, and interviews with possible witnesses, none of which yielded the clear breakthrough everyone desperately wanted. Amid the hunt for external answers, internal debates simmered. In the Grant household, pain sometimes curdled into tension. Melissa's siblings, suddenly burdened with their own anxious questions, replayed their last conversations with her again and again. Had she mentioned being followed? Had she complained about someone at the hospital behaving oddly? Did I miss something? Became a quiet mantra that haunted nights and echoed through the kitchen when the family gathered over coffee. Outside, the very geography of Maplewood became suspect. Community watch groups began logging unfamiliar vehicles, reporting strangers who wandered the street even in broad daylight. Conversation at the local diner sounded more like amateur investigation than small talk. Speculation filled the air as residents traded rumors, anxieties, and hopes for justice. Some blamed growing gang activity in nearby cities. Others wondered if the perpetrator was an outsider drawn to Maplewood's increasingly diverse and bustling character. Every plausible scenario exposed deeper fears about the limits of neighborliness and the fragility of perceived safety. Through it all, the failure to untangle the mystery of Melissa's last hour gnawed at everyone. Local newspapers ran editorials anguishing over the lack of progress. Activist groups demanded better lighting, more foot patrols, and investments in public infrastructure. The broken phone, after all, had become a symbol for systemic neglect as well as personal tragedy. For weeks the town held candlelight vigils, both to honor Melissa and keep the story on the front page, hoping publicity and vigilance would force a break in the case. "Don't let her become a forgotten headline," one sign read. "Someone out there knows what happened." To this day, even with a conviction and years of retrospection, those core questions, the how, the why, the what if, continue to haunt the people who loved her. For the grants, for law enforcement, for a community that still lays flowers on the neglected stretch of sidewalk each February, the story will always be unfinished, defined as much by its unanswered mysteries as its tragic resolution. The Pursuit Campaign and Breakthrough. The shockwaves from Melissa Grant's murder had hardly begun to subside when law enforcement launched one of the most intense manhunts in New Jersey's history. The sense of purpose among the local and state officers pulsed through every briefing room, every midnight strategy session, and every rolling patrol across the map's jagged, anxious lines. For Maplewood, the quest for justice would become nothing short of an all-consuming crusade. Detective Frank Donnelly and his team established a temporary command center in a vacant storefront near the square. Maps covering each wall were riddled with pins, notes, and photos. Every officer was assigned to comb neighborhoods, question residents, and chase down even the most hopelessly faint of leads. State police brought in helicopters and canine units, and for the first time in decades, the local sheriff appealed for public help in nightly news bulletins, pleading for anyone with information to step forward, no matter how trivial it might seem. The investigation quickly zeroed in on details gathered from witnesses during the frantic days and nights after the discovery. A crucial clue: reports of a white sedan lingering near the train station at the time Melissa vanished. One witness described a strange metallic rattle coming from the car. Another noted the vehicle's left taillight was out. Forensic teams pored over tire imprints in the Cedar Ridge meadow, matching them to common makes and models. The police cross-referenced recent car thefts with this information, and a fresh lead crystallized. A known car theft ring operating in several neighboring counties had reported exactly such a vehicle missing the morning after the murder. Public tips, previously a wildfire of rumor and heartbreak, now took on new urgency. State police set up a special hotline. Over 1,000 calls poured in during the first week. The majority were dead ends, anxious neighbors reporting lost wallets, teenagers exaggerating late-night sightings, and some prank calls. Yet in the middle of this cacophony, a woman named Glenda Jefferson came forward. She remembered seeing two men she'd never noticed before near the edge of the station's parking lot, both smoking heavily and frequently glancing at the station clock. Her detailed recollection sent sketches of the suspects circulating to every patrol car and convenience store in the county. Meanwhile, local and state detectives began to focus on connections between this car theft ring, well known for their boldness and ties to more organized crime, and recent violent robberies within the region. They combed social networks, wiring logs, and small-time informants, looking for even a glimmer of possible overlap. The multi-agency task force's weekly updates, distributed in thick binders with red tabs marking high-probability suspects, became the pulse of the hunt. One evening at a local diner, an off-duty officer overheard snippets of conversation between two young men discussing the heat after Cedar Ridge. The details matched some of the secret knowledge police had kept under wraps. The officer reported it, and within 48 hours, surveillance was established on both individuals. Around the same time, one member of the car theft ring slipped. A routine traffic stop ended with a nervous offhand comment that he had nothing to do with that girl in the field, unprompted and out of context. This was all the spark the investigators needed to dig deeper. With mounting pressure, police and prosecutors doubled down. They requested and received wiretap warrants for several gang members' phones, and began meticulously monitoring those calls, hoping for a guilty slip. Simultaneously, efforts to infiltrate the ring became a top priority. Detectives persuaded a woman who was sometimes romantically involved with one of the core suspects to wear a wire. The courage this act required was immense. She faced daily danger, not just from her associates but from her own fears. While investigators gathered evidence, the entire community was swept up in a wave of vigilance and suspicion. Store owners installed new security cameras, volunteers fanned out nightly, leaving flyers in train stations and bar parking lots. Each new development during the manhunt was relayed by local radio, dissected in town hall meetings, and posted in coffee shops where photographs of Melissa, her radiant smile forever frozen, watched over the town. Parents grew newly protective, forbidding children from walking home after dusk, while neighborly trust was replaced, for a time, with second-guessing and worry. For much of that spring, the mood in Maplewood was a volatile mix of hope and frustration, especially as a string of near misses charged the air with anticipation. A car matching the description was pulled over, but the suspects proved unrelated. Tire casts seemed a near match, then failed to deliver conclusive results. Detectives worked 18-hour days, sleeping at their desks or in their cars, refusing to let the case slip into cold status. And then came the pivotal break. A secretly recorded conversation revealed the chilling reality. On the wire, the suspect argued with his girlfriend about the danger of talking too much. Within his ramblings, he let slip damning details only the killer would know: the description of Melissa's jewelry, the field's exact contours, and how the crime had gone wrong. The transmission, raw and trembling with adrenaline, was enough for law enforcement to move in. Early one morning, as dawn broke pink over the train yard, SWAT teams swept through the suspects' apartments, hauling 4 men and 2 women into custody. The search warrants yielded further troves: a ripped sleeve torn from Melissa's jacket, traces of her blood on a backseat carpet scrubbed but not enough, and a cache of stolen goods linking the suspects to other robberies in the region. Interrogations began immediately, conducted through long days and sleepless nights under the pall of fluorescent lights. At first, the group stuck to their story. They denied knowing Melissa, claimed no involvement, and scoffed at the idea that one of their number could be guilty of such violence. But the pressure was relentless. Prosecutors played the wiretap recordings and laid out the mounting forensic evidence with methodical precision. Legal counsel entered the picture, but not all of the accused could afford top defense, and cracks started to show. It was the youngest member, a 19-year-old with trembling hands and an exhausted, haunted expression, who finally broke. In a tearful, stumbling statement, he admitted to being present the night Melissa died, though he insisted he hadn't participated in the violence. His confession, though self-serving, matched key timeline details and corroborated evidence found in the group's hideout. His cooperation was rewarded with a reduced sentence, but more critically, his account solidified the case against the ring's ringleader, the man who, according to the inside witness, had both planned the robbery and delivered the fatal blows. Parallel to the confessions, forensic scientists delivered more. DNA traces, flecks of saliva, hair recovered from Melissa's clothing, and minute skin cells lodged under her fingernails tied 2 suspects unambiguously to the scene of the crime. The needle of the investigation, once lost in a haystack, now pointed clearly to a nucleus of guilt. News of the breakthrough spread instantly. The Grant family, weary from months of grief and agonized waiting, received the call in the early hours from Detective Donnelly himself. Their reactions were complicated: overwhelming relief, burning sorrow, and an enduring pain no arrest could erase. Yet, knowing that names and faces would finally be brought to trial, and that Maplewood could begin to close this dark chapter, provided a measure of peace. For the town, the breakthrough sparked both celebration and reckoning. Candlelight vigils were held on the village green, this time with a spirit of gratitude toward the officers and volunteers who never gave up. People who had barely spoken, neighbors divided by suspicion, embraced again in the lingering twilight. But the capture of Melissa's killers did not erase the larger wounds: the loss of innocence, the fear that had gripped parents and teachers, and the realization that evil had worn such unremarkable faces within their midst. Local leaders launched a campaign to invest in community safety and youth outreach, vowing always to remember Melissa's legacy and to work so that no other resident would share such a fate. The manhunt and its dramatic resolution set precedents for law enforcement across the state. Prosecutors, advocates, and lawmakers studied its lessons for years afterward, pushing for expanded resources for missing person investigations, more robust public communication, and trauma-informed care for victims' families. New protocols were written into county policy, stipulating rapid collaboration between jurisdictions and immediate engagement with both media and marginalized communities. And yet, even as officialdom kept records and crafted policy, the story remained heartbreakingly close to home for Maplewood. Melissa Grant's mural, painted by local artists on the side of the old community building, became a place of pilgrimage, not just to mourn, but to commit again to the vigilance and compassion that had fueled the search for justice. In the end, the manhunt was remembered for more than just its arrest records and courtroom victories. It redefined how a town could pull together in the face of unspeakable loss, and how justice, though often agonizingly slow, could finally be won by refusing to look away. Clues and confession. The investigation, having reached a fever pitch in Maplewood and beyond, was at a crossroads. Detectives and prosecutors pored over clues, desperate for anything that could shift the case from conjecture to resolution. It was then, amid this grinding uncertainty, that small, almost imperceptible breakthroughs began to emerge. The forensic findings offered tantalizing partial DNA profiles and the partial print from the lipstick-stained rock, but nothing was conclusive. Investigators intensified their efforts, re-interviewing previous suspects, tailing familiar faces, and leveraging every ounce of psychological pressure possible on the known criminal elements around Cedar Ridge. It was the group linked to the stolen white sedan, a car unearthed in a Newark alley weeks after Melissa's body had been found, that drew the greatest scrutiny. The vehicle, stripped almost bare, bore trace evidence, fibers matching those from Melissa's coat, and a strand of her hair wedged near the rear seat. The car's ownership, funneled through a series of shell identities and fake paperwork, pointed inexorably to a notorious group already known for violent robberies, break-ins, and more than once, sexual assault. Detective Donnelly and his team orchestrated a careful, methodical approach. Rather than kicking down doors, they set up surveillance and covertly monitored the suspects, watching for slips in behavior, a sudden show of wealth, or even a causal remark to a friend. Hours of wiretapped phone calls churned up nothing at first but mundane chatter and criminal bravado. But pressure was mounting. The group, evidently aware they were being followed, began to fray at the edges, paranoia driving rifts within their circle. Late one night, two detectives caught a break while surveilling a dingy all-night diner frequented by the suspects. Ricardo Garcia, an underling in the gang, usually content to stay in the background, was overheard arguing with his girlfriend. Their voices, rising over the jukebox, caught the attention of the detectives in the next booth. He insisted, again and again, "I had nothing to do with that girl, I only drove the car." It was a phrase that, once reported, sent shudders through the investigative team. Under pressure and with their world closing in, those involved often tried to distance themselves from the most violent acts of a group, sometimes accidentally revealing more than they intended. From there, events unfolded quickly. The detectives arranged for Garcia's girlfriend, approached as a confidential informant, to meet with investigators. After initial reluctance and with legal assurances of protection, she agreed to wear a wire and resume contact with Ricardo and another suspect, Jamal Walker. Their subsequent conversation, painfully tense, half whispers and long silences, offered the missing link. "Don't go talking about what happened to that nurse," Jamal was recorded saying. "We can't pin the blood on us if they've got nothing but the car." Garcia muttered, "It would have been different if she'd just given us her purse and kept walking." With this covert evidence in hand, police swooped in. One suspect, confronted with the prospect of prison for a life sentence, confessed within hours, though, predictably, the confession attempted to minimize his role. According to his statement, what began as a robbery spiraled out of control. There was anger when Melissa screamed and tried to run, a panic that led to brutal violence. He claimed he was only a lookout, but the specifics he provided, exact location, time, how they disposed of her bag, the sequence of threats, could only have been known to someone present at the scene. Police, by now adept at reading the subtext of confessions, pressed further, using each man's version to catch another's lie. It was a delicate dance of psychological manipulation, showing suspects contradictory evidence and staging confrontations between those who blamed each other. Meanwhile, the forensic team matched the partial DNA found under Melissa's fingernails to two of the suspects, stakes rising as charges were prepared. When the findings were presented during questioning, the last holdouts broke, anger and fear spilling out into teary testimonies and resigned head-hanging. In return for guilty pleas and a chance to avoid the death penalty, the primary suspects agreed to lay out the full timeline for authorities and eventually for the grieving Grant family. The confession phase was public and raw. An initial press conference with the district attorney triggered a tidal wave of media, but beneath the circus-like atmosphere, the mood in Maplewood was unsettled. For some, the arrest brought a measure of relief. For others, especially the Grant family, there was only sorrow that such terrible violence could have touched their community. Statements from the suspects released in transcripts revealed a disturbing randomness to the crime. The group hadn't targeted Melissa personally. She happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and her refusal to surrender became an act of courage that may have sparked the fatal escalation. In the weeks leading up to the trial, further details emerged. The wire recordings and confessions provided a roadmap of the killing, and some personal items of Melissa's, her work badge, the homemade necklace, were recovered where the car had been abandoned, adding another layer of heartbreak for the family. The suspects' stories, full of contradiction and accusation, played out in grim detail in front of the grand jury, culminating in indictments on charges of murder, kidnapping, robbery, and tampering with evidence. For investigators, the moment was bittersweet. Years would pass before they could process what they'd witnessed. The mix of base cruelty, accidental slips that became confessions, and the haunted expressions of men who had not anticipated the weight of actual accountability. For the town, the confessions finally shifted the tragedy from the realm of unknown terror to a known, if deeply painful, reality. As closure set in, a relative and incomplete peace, a single refrain lingered everywhere. Justice had taken its course, but a life lost could never be replaced. The trial of the century and the ongoing tragedy. The trial following the brutal murder of Melissa Grant was unlike anything Maplewood or New Jersey had ever witnessed. The media quickly labeled it the trial of the century, and the label stuck, both for its raw emotional intensity and its seismic impact on public discourse. For Melissa's family, the weeks and months that led up to the courtroom confrontation became an ordeal in themselves. Interviews with press, meetings with prosecutors, and runs through the grim evidence that would soon become public record. The anticipation of justice was paired with dread, as if reliving the loss over and over. From the outset, the local courthouse was transformed into a fortress. Metal barricades ringed the perimeter, police officers managed teeming crowds, and news vans lined the block, humming and gleaming in the morning sunlight. Melissa's parents, Ronald and Cynthia, were escorted each day through back entrances, protected from both unwanted media attention and possible threats. Daniel, Melissa's estranged husband, became a reluctant figurehead, grieving, stoic, and endlessly hounded for comment by reporters seeking a headline. Inside, the courtroom pulsed with anticipation. Proceedings began with the formal reading of charges: felony murder, aggravated sexual assault, armed robbery, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. The 5 defendants, representing the ringleaders and key accomplices of the Cedar Ridge group, sat at the defense table surrounded by high-profile attorneys. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Felicia Lowry, wasted no time painting a picture of calculated brutality, presenting both the chilling confession tapes and a forensic narrative constructed from months of painstaking investigation. Melissa's voice, once vibrant in the memories of loved ones, now resonated through dry transcripts and evidence spreadsheets. The jury, an ensemble painstakingly screened for impartiality, nonetheless displayed visible signs of emotional distress as Lowry detailed Melissa's final moments. The district attorney's opening statement left no ambiguity. This was not a crime of chance, it was a catastrophic collision of malice, opportunity, and failure of human decency. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses. Forensic experts presented detailed breakdowns of the DNA evidence and garment fibers. Medical examiners described, with professional precision but clear gravity, the tragic injuries Melissa had suffered. Detectives mapped the route from the train station to the fateful meadow, overlaying timelines with phone records and eyewitness testimony. Each piece was meticulously placed to build an airtight case, not only showing what happened, but how and why. And then, the most difficult witnesses, the Grant family. Their testimony, delivered through tears and trembling voices, transfixed the room. Cynthia Grant's description of the night Melissa disappeared brought the gallery to a hush. Ronald's recounting of the family's agony during those uncertain days drew sobs even from court staff. Daniel shared memories of their life together, fragments of happier times, and the pain of being suspected, a subtle but powerful echo against the defense's claims of wrongful accusation. Defense attorneys attempted to sow doubt, as their duty mandated. They highlighted the chaotic circumstances of that February evening, questioning the certainty of eyewitnesses, or implying that the confessions were obtained under duress. Some tried to leverage the gang's notorious reputation as evidence of bias. Others implied that Melissa's own decision to walk home alone might have contributed to her vulnerability. These arguments, however, largely fell flat. The confessions, corroborated by physical evidence, the discovery of Melissa's belongings and forensic connections, were an insurmountable mountain. Days spilled into weeks. Public interest never waned. Reporters faithfully chronicled each development, sometimes camping outside the courthouse for days. Opinion columns debated the adequacy of police response, community responsibility, and the broader failures that might have allowed such a crime to occur. Activists organized candlelight vigils and Justice for Melissa rallies, both honoring the victim and holding up her story as a warning about threats faced by women walking alone and the cracks in public safety infrastructure. When it came time for closing arguments, District Attorney Lowry delivered a searing denunciation of the actions and choices that led to Melissa's murder. She called upon jurors not just to convict the men sitting before them, but to send a message about violence, about the dignity of every life, and about the responsibility a community shares in protecting its most vulnerable. The defense, lacking a coherent alternative explanation, appealed to emotion, reminding the jury of the heavy cost of justice, the possibility of wrongful confession, and the prospect of lives forever changed behind bars. The jury's deliberations lasted only 3 days. On a raw autumn afternoon, their verdict was finally read before a packed courtroom, guilty on all charges for each defendant. The judge, clearly moved by the gravity of the crime and the meticulousness of the prosecution, imposed the most severe sentences allowed by law, life imprisonment without parole for all 5 men. The courtroom burst into a complicated mix of relief, grief, rage, and solemn satisfaction. For the family there was no joy, only a weary, tearful closure, a sense that the world would never quite feel whole again. But the story didn't end with the gavel's fall. The trial left a profound scar on Maplewood. For months after sentencing, the town continued to reckon with the implications, how a violent gang could take root undetected, how public infrastructure failures, like a broken payphone, could change the course of so many lives, how every neighbor shared some sliver of blame or responsibility for what transpired. The Grant family transformed their grief into action. They spearheaded a victims' advocacy foundation providing resources and counseling not only to families facing tragedy but also to at-risk youth in the community. Daniel, despite being cleared, struggled with the stigma. His path to healing was long and non-linear. Cynthia spoke publicly at schools and churches, urging vigilance, systemic change, and greater empathy for survivors. Ronald, once a man of few words, became a vocal proponent of infrastructure reform, lobbying for better lighting, safer transit options, and more robust social support networks across New Jersey. The trial's resonance extended beyond Maplewood. State legislators, prompted in part by Melissa's story and the advocacy efforts of her family and friends, debated, and in some cases passed stricter laws around public safety, victim compensation, and criminal procedure. The privacy of the Grant family was never truly restored, but their willingness to remain in the spotlight helped sustain the urgency of reform. Each year on the anniversary of Melissa's death, Maplewood gathered for a memorial in the park that now bore her name. The events combined sorrow with hope, stories of Melissa's life, but also updates on community projects inspired by her legacy. For some, justice felt bitter and insufficient. A verdict couldn't bring Melissa back or truly heal the wounds. For others, the trial had forced an awakening, a sense of collective accountability that reshaped the town's priorities. Over time, the trial of the century became part of Maplewood's complicated identity. Law schools and journalism classes studied it as a textbook case in community trauma, legal process, and the balance between victims' rights and due process protections for the accused. Meanwhile, the ongoing commitment of the Grant family inspired neighboring towns to adopt similar advocacy initiatives, and survivors from all walks of life found comfort and guidance in their example. Ultimately, the trial revealed something fundamental about both justice and loss. That time itself cannot fully erase either wounds or hope. The verdict brought resolution, but every autumn when the leaves began to fall and the story re-entered public memory, people paused not just to mourn, but to renew the promise that Melissa's life, and her family's fight for justice, would never be forgotten. Consequences. Society shares and remembers together. In the wake of the trial and the long, arduous journey toward justice for Melissa Grant, Maplewood was a changed town. What had once been a community quietly confident in its safety and resilience found itself face to face with the realities of violence, loss, and the fragile nature of neighborly trust. The aftermath of Melissa's murder did not end with the verdict. The ripples spread outward, affecting every member of the town and inspiring changes that would endure for years to come. At first, grief was the dominant force. Memorial services overflowed not only at the newly renamed Melissa Grant Park but throughout churches, schools, and even small coffee shops. For months, windows were adorned with ribbons and candles, gentle beacons of remembrance that illuminated silent neighborhood streets long into the night. Families who had never met Melissa felt her absence. Her photograph became a symbol of lost innocence and just as powerfully of hope. The hope that evil would not have the last word in Maplewood's story. That hope became fuel for collective action. Clubs and youth organizations, once preoccupied with holiday events or sports, shifted their focus to personal safety seminars, mental health outreach, and advocacy for marginalized residents. Parents and teachers rallied to teach children not only how to avoid danger but also to look out for one another, emphasizing compassion without sacrificing vigilance. Town meetings, which had previously dispersed after quick discussions about potholes or school budgets, now ran late into the evening with passionate debates about crime prevention, street lighting, and the responsibility of local government. A key legacy of Melissa's tragedy was the founding of the Grant Foundation, a local initiative that took root in Maplewood and within just a couple of years began to influence policy and practice far beyond its borders. The foundation provided crisis counseling for families experiencing trauma, organized neighborhood safety walks, and held annual events that promoted diversity and inclusion as shields against the kind of isolation and fear that allowed violence to go unnoticed. It helped launch the county's first volunteer victim advocacy program, pairing trained former survivors with those newly struck by loss so that no one would feel alone in their grief. Public policy, too, shifted in response. After impassioned testimony from the Grant family and an outpouring of support from Maplewood's residents, town leaders approved a sweeping package of reforms. Streetlights were installed or upgraded throughout neighborhoods, and an emergency callbox system modeled after those in large cities appeared along walking paths and near the train station. Police training protocols emphasized trauma-informed approaches, specifically to foster trust with victims and their families. Local schools adopted curricula on safety awareness, bystander intervention, and conflict resolution, not as a response to a single tragedy, but as an ongoing promise to protect the next generation. Perhaps the deepest change was subtler, a shift in the way people related to one another. Where once Maplewood prided itself on minding its own business, neighbors now checked in on each other more often. Block parties took on new meaning as vehicles for both support and vigilance. The community center, where Melissa had volunteered, became a hub not only for celebration, but also for healing circles, group counseling, and town hall forums, openly discussing issues of safety, prejudice, and belonging. People spoke more frankly about mental health, trauma, and the need to break cycles of silence that could let danger take root unnoticed. Melissa's name remained at the heart of these changes. Each year on the anniversary of her death, the town gathered in the park carrying candles, telling stories, and making pledges, some public, some whispered in the dark, to keep watch over one another. Local artists created murals and mosaics in her honor, students wrote essays about her legacy. Even the local paper ran an annual series profiling positive community efforts propelled by her memory, ensuring that her story did not simply fade into the background noise of tragedy. But not every consequence was positive, nor every wound easily healed. For some, the shadow of Melissa's murder lingered in anxiety, suspicion, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Parents for years afterward hesitated to let their children walk home alone or spend time outside after dark. Some families moved away, their faith in the town shaken beyond repair. There were debates, sometimes heated, about how much safety could realistically be achieved, and what deeper social currents might still threaten Maplewood. The pain of the Grant family, though less acute over time, never fully receded. Cynthia and Ronald became fierce advocates but carried a private sadness behind every speech and embrace. Daniel, freed from suspicion but not from sorrow, invested himself in mentorship, always fighting the sense of a life forever divided by a single night. Even as these scars remained, Maplewood's transformation was undeniable. It embraced the paradox that commemoration and growth could exist alongside pain. "Never again" became both a warning and a rallying cry, repeated in town halls and playgrounds, in the foundation's brochures and the murals that colored downtown walls. The tragedy of Melissa Grant was never seen as a failure to move on, but a commitment to remember, to protect, and to build something better from the ashes of loss.